So, now let's talk a little bit more specifically about the zygomatic arch. In our notes before, we circled this structure right through here. So coming off the temporal bone, there's an arm called a process. A process is a projection or arm extending from a bone. Now, this structure right here, this bone, which is number 4, so go ahead and label in your notes in this diagram because you have a copy of it. Go ahead and label that bone number 4 is the temporal bone. Okay. Now, the temporal bone is going to have a process which is tagged down here at number 11. Okay. I'm going to write this over here to the side. So number 11 is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Okay, so this blue is our zygomatic arch, but now we have the temporal process, so I'm going to highlight that in blue. Okay, that's our zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Now, the zygomatic process of the temporal bone connects and articulates with a process called the temporal process, which I'm going to put in green. And this temporal process comes off of this cheekbone called the zygomatic bone. So it appears that number 6, so number 6 is the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. These two processes, the zygomatic process of the temporal bone articulates and connects with the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, and together they form the zygomatic arch on the side of the skull. So you've probably already noticed this, but the temporal bone has the zygomatic process. The zygomatic bone has the temporal process. So the bones have switched names for the processes that they have. Okay? Not quite sure why they did that, but that's how they did it. Okay? So that creates this zygomatic arch. Okay? All right. Now, another thing I want to look at real quick to follow this up, I want to skip for just a second in our notes, and I want to go to slide 35, and I want to talk about the zygomatic bone. So we've talked about the temporal bone and how it gives off the zygomatic process. I want to talk about the zygomatic bone for just a moment. This zygomatic bone is our it makes up our cheekbones. And so it makes up the inferior and lateral portion of the orbital socket. Go ahead and stay on this slide, but I just want to back up for just a second to where you can see the skull head on. Here are the two zygomatic bones here. They make up this lateral inferior portion of the orbital socket. They make up the cheeks. We usually say that people, when they have a prominent zygomatic bone, we say that they have high cheeks or prominent cheeks. The bones come up quite a bit. Now, zygomatic bones, what do you think, facial or neurocranium? Definitely facial cranium. Then they're going to wrap around to the side. That's where we go back to our zygomatic bone on slide 35. And this is where it wraps around, and this bone stops right through here, and it gives off the small temporal process that articulates with the zygomatic process of the temporal bone and creates the zygomatic arch. Okay? So, on the zygomatic bone, other than the cheekbone, being able to identify it and knowing its process, the temporal process that makes up the zygomatic arch, that's all we have for the zygomatic bones. There's 2 of them because they're bilateral for the cheeks. Okay.